Hello and welcome. This is going to be our lab for our New York office additional domain controller. So the business is now growing and Elmzo Tech is going to open a new office in New York, and as you can see in the diagram that we got a New York lab where we are going to have the same setup as we have in Sacramento. And in Sacramento we already set up our primary domain controller and our first Exchange Server 2016, and we are done with this lab. But now it's time to set up a new lab at New York office, and the New York office is gonna have the domain controller and Exchange server. But this domain controller is going to be the Exchange, not the primary domain controller. This domain controller is going to be the additional domain controller, and this Exchange server is going to be the second Exchange server in your organization. So I have just prepared a lab scenario for you where it says your company is growing and they want you to set up an additional domain controller. You need to install Windows Server 2012 and then install and configure your additional domain controller. So what they're asking you is to install Server 2012 R2 and then do the installation and configuration for your additional domain controller. And they want you to make sure that you use minimum 1 GB of RAM, 20 GB of storage. Server name should be NYC, which is New York. Elmjo, EJO is Elmjo, and then domain controller 01. And then the IP address is going to be 10.10.254.54 and the subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. So what we are trying to do in here is we are trying to set up another additional another domain controller, which is going to be the additional domain controller for our New York lab or New York office, where our users will connect directly to that additional domain controller and log in. So let's get started, and I'll explain more while I'm doing the lab for you. So as you can see that I already got my Sacramento office domain controller and an Exchange server setup. Right now it's in suspended mode, so I'm just gonna turn them on or resume it so that it's going to respond when I am going to install my New York office domain controller. So the lab says that first you have to install Windows Server 2012. So in this first step of our lab, we are going to install Windows Server 2012 R2 for our domain controller in New York office. Right click again, new virtual machine, press next, typical is good. The R2 is detected, the ISO, and next. I don't want to use any license or username for now. It's asking me the virtual machine name. Again, we have to follow the naming convention in order to make sure that we are just following the best practices, and it is always good. So it is going to be New York, Elmjo, domain controller 01, and it is going to be located at in my D drive, New York virtual machines. I already have a folder for it, and I'll just name it New York EJO DC01. Okay, press next. So I'm gonna use like 20 GB for my domain controller. That's for training purposes or educational purposes that we are trying to accomplish right now. But in organizations, you always have to follow the minimum requirements that you get from Microsoft. So most organizations, when they purchase a server or they use virtualization systems like VMware, what they do is, because they have much more resources, they use like 200 or 300 GB for their domain controller server, uh, because they always want to make sure that whenever their business grows, they are not gonna run out of space. So it always depends on your company's requirement, policies, and how much budget you have, or how you wanna assign storage or RAM or processor for your servers or if operating systems, for your domain controllers, for your Exchange servers, but always make sure that you are using the minimum requirements from Microsoft, because if you do not use the minimum requirements and you are running a production environment in your organization, what's going to happen is that every day, like, you're gonna add more users. When you add more users, it's gonna occupy more space, so you're gonna run out of space. So always do a good planning when you are allocating a storage for a server or allocating a RAM or anything. Plan first, make sure you meet the requirements. You meet the requirements, and always use, like, for example, Microsoft says that you have to use 30 GB, but if you're planning, like, to make sure that in future you will not have any problems, you should use like 100 plus 50, like 150 GB, so that you will be having no problem for a long time. So this is long time solution, so make sure you meet the requirements all the time. So this is again the summary, and I'll press on finish, and then the installation for our New York domain controller will begin. And once the installation is done, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna rename the server name, and then I'm gonna assign an IP address based on our lab, and then I'll make sure that it is going to have connectivity with our domain controller at Sacramento office, because this is our primary domain controller. And whenever you're installing additional domain controller, you always need to make sure that your additional domain controller can connect to your primary domain controller, because if you do not have any connectivity from additional to primary, you will not be able to install domain controller. That's how it works. Actually, that's how it works. So no connectivity, no additional domain controller installation or setup. So always make sure that before you make a domain controller as an additional domain controller, make sure that you are able to connect to your primary domain controller. So if you ask again that primary and additional, can you tell us the differences? Yes, sure. So for the first time, when you install Active Directory or domain controller, that server, that server is actually called your primary domain controller, your main domain controller. So uh, the additional domain controller that you install is going to be installed in your existing domain. So you're installing a domain in, like, whenever you are making a server, a domain controller, you're making it in a domain controller in your existing domain, which is in here your Sacramento domain controller. So what is the purpose of additional domain controller? The purpose of additional domain controller is quite simple. So in an organization or production environment or companies where you're running, like you have like 6,000 users in there, do you think it's a good idea to let all users log in through one domain controller only, through one primary domain controller only? No, it is not a good idea. Like, in one time 6,000 users tries to log into one domain controller, it's actually not good. So it's like I'm throwing a ball and telling you to catch, like I am throwing like 6,000 balls in one time and asking you to catch all those balls in one time, and you will not be able to do that. So the domain controller, like powerful domain controllers, will be like somehow able to accept like more connections, but it is not a good idea. It is not the best practice. Never do that. Like in an organization where you're running 6,000 users, you don't need to have one domain controller. You need to have like at least 5 or 6 domain controllers, so that what it's gonna do, what additional domain controller is gonna do, it's gonna do load balancing. So first request comes to DCO1, second request goes to DCO2, third request goes to DCO3. That's how it works. So it is doing load balancing. And another great thing is that if your Sacramento domain controller goes down, you will not lose anything. You still have your additional domain controller in New York or in your like Sacramento site or any other site. Like you have more than one domain controller and you got additional domain controller. So you will be able to make the additional domain controller as a primary domain controller so that your users will still be able to log in, so you will not lose anything. So let me give you a great example that I was working for an office in Sacramento and I was doing consulting for them, and I saw that the office was small, and the guy in there had like one domain controller and one exchange server. So then I asked him that why are you using one domain controller? Because if your main domain controller goes down and you have no backup and nothing, then how are you going to restore it? How are you going to make sure that your users will not have any downtime? And then I recommended like additional domain controller for him, and then told him that if you have additional domain controller and your primary domain controller goes down, then you are good to go. Like you're not gonna have any issues, you're not gonna have any downtime, any problems, or you will not be in a critical situation. So always make sure that you have an additional domain controller when running an exchange environment, especially because all your emails and everything is stored like in your exchange server, and your exchange server is integrated with your active directory domain. And when you lose your active directory domain and you have no backup, no additional domain controller, then you will lose everything, and it's going to be a very big disaster recovery that you have to do, and you will face a lot of problems. So if you want to have a reliable, if you want to have a very good exchange server environment, like trouble free, make sure that you have more than one domain controller. So our server is installed, uh, and the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna right click on my computer, and then I'll simply let me right click. Okay, right click, properties, and advanced system settings, computer name, work group, no, the computer name, NYC, um, NYC, EJO, and it is going to be our domain controller. I'll press OK, and it is going to ask me to restart, but I'm not going to restart for now because I need to assign the IP address and check the connectivity. So restart later, and right click here, open network and sharing center, change adapter settings, go to properties, TCP IP version 4, and then 10.10.254.54, 255.255.255.0, 10.10.254.53. Press OK, and you're good to go. So one other thing that we were doing with our other virtual machines, you right click on your virtual machine, go to network adapters, make it host only, so that it's gonna be connected with other virtual machines and it's not going to be connected to your physical computer network adapter. Um, Especially when you are in office and you don't want your virtual machine to just connect to your physical network and create problems. So ping 10.10.254.53, I can ping it, which is good. Another command to make sure that you will be able to make this as a domain controller is nslookup, which means that it is now resolving SAC EJO DC01. So it is now connected. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna restart this server, and then we will be installing our domain controller in our next lab. So While I'm just recording the video, and the installation is on the process, I'm giving you informations, and those informations are really useful. And I hope that you have learned something. And I'm gonna see you on next video. Thank you.